I love analogies, and I'm going to use this podcast to test one. So, this point about the fact that the IRS had a good filing season and collections were robust. So, why should we care about these cuts? Imagine there's a bad storm and your power goes out and you're worried about all the stuff in your fridge. So you're keeping the door closed. You open the fridge an hour later, things are still cold and still fresh. Doesn't mean that they're going to stay that way, right? If the power is cut and the power is cut indefinitely, eventually you're going to have a problem.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James Christian Blockwood. For this week's episode, we welcome two titans of IRS leadership, former commissioners Danny Werfel and John Koskinen, both of whom are Academy Fellows. They discuss the challenges and changes at the IRS, including budget cuts, workforce reductions, and the impact on taxpayer services. We get an up-close look at the future of tax administration and the importance of maintaining an effective IRS. Danny Werfel was the 50th IRS Commissioner. He previously served as Controller of the Office of Management and Budget and Global Leader of Boston Consulting Group's public sector practice. He has received numerous awards for his contributions to federal financial management. John Koskinen was the 48th IRS Commissioner under Presidents Barack Obama and Donald Trump. His extensive leadership experience spans both public and private sectors. Welcome, John and Danny.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Danny, let's start with you. During your time as IRS Commissioner, you focused on customer experience and making sure people understood what the IRS was doing. A lot has changed since then. During your time, you were set to have an influx of financial resources and personnel. That also seems to have changed. What do you make of the current status of the IRS and its ability to meet its mission?
Well, bottom line is I'm worried. When I joined, there was a push to invest in the IRS because the organization was faltering. Coming out of COVID and after a decade of budget cuts, what was basically stretching at the seams was now tearing at the seams in terms of a record low level of service on the phone lines at the IRS. It was really hard to get through to us. Many of our walk-in centers were shuttered or understaffed. The lines around the block, people couldn't get an appointment when they needed help. The technology was stagnant. IRS.gov and all the tools looked the same. Every time you came back, there was no evolution like you'd see with other government agencies or other private sector ventures like banks and others. And audit rates were anemic at every level. What happened was in that moment, the decision was made, we don't want a tax authority that is failing. That's not good for the US. And so the resources were put in place to reverse all of these negative trends. We started with a hiring surge because we weren't aware of, and I'm still not aware of, a turnkey technology that solves all of that. We hired thousands of people to get on the phones, train them, and get them ready to answer calls. We hired people to staff our walk-in centers. We hired people to be in our submission processing centers to open more envelopes and eliminate these paper backlogs that had emerged. We hired more accountants and auditors so that these anemic audit rates would reverse and be more healthy again. We, side by side with that, started investing in technologies to modernize, to make the experience more modern for taxpayers, and to automate the back end so we could, over time, imagine and affect a smaller workforce with technology driving some of the solutions. But right now, all of that, all of the positive momentum that we had is being disrupted. I'm not sure I know what the new strategic vision is beyond just a more automated IRS with a much smaller workforce. I'd feel better about it if I had more details on what will be automated by when and what are the expectations of performance in a variety of these different areas. What should we expect next filing season in terms of level of service on the phones, availability of walk-in appointments, basic customer satisfaction metrics that we look closely at? What can we expect in terms of updates to the tools taxpayers can use to file and deal with the IRS digitally? and what can we expect with respect to enforcement and collections. And if I saw the specifics of that vision and then understood at least some idea of how that's going to be achieved with all the layoffs, rifts, and reductions, I would be less worried. But I'm waiting to see that before my worry would go away.
So, John, you just heard Danny say he's worried and looking for the vision. Let's get your take. The vision generally comes from the leader of the organization. It's not unusual to have acting officials, but there have been 4 in the last 4 months. Can you give us a sense of what impact that might be having and what your take is on the current status of the IRS?
Well, my experience leads me to be very, very concerned that we're headed for a major problem. When I was the commissioner, I started with 100,000 people. We had budget cuts, and the only way we could deal with that was through attrition. So we ended up with about 80,000. When I left, about 20,000 fewer. 100,000 was where we started in the year 2000. So we're now, when you get to 80,000, you're 20,000 people below where you were 25 years ago, which is, we're now talking about going to 50,000 or 40,000 or some much smaller number. And over time, all of us who served at the IRS understand where there are great opportunities for improvements in efficiency and customer satisfaction. But to achieve those, you've got to have a plan and a vision, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen by having 20,000 people accept buyouts and another 11,000 be forced out of the agency. And not having a budget, post-budget apparently zeroes out IT modernization. So my concern is if you enter the next filing season, and preparations always start in June and July with the IT people, if you enter next filing season with 30,000 fewer people and no significant changes in how this processing works, I think you're going to have trouble getting through on the phone. I used to warn people when I was commissioner, the taxpayer service would be abysmal. The money disappeared and you just didn't have enough people to answer the phones. I am concerned that there is not a plan. I have not heard anyone put forward an explanation of what they're about, other than, well, we can do it with better IT and we'll somehow overnight almost create a new system and new efficiencies. In my experience with the complexity of the IRS IT system, even with the best people working on it, is you're not going to be able to accomplish that in the next 3 to 6 months. I think we're in deep trouble for the next filing season. And ultimately, why this makes no sense, this is an administration worried about the deficit and the debt. And it therefore makes no sense to, on the one hand, worry about the deficit, on the other hand, hamstring or undermine the ability of your accounts receivable to function. I spent 20 years in the private sector managing large turnarounds of failed enterprises. And it never occurred to us to starve the revenue side of the enterprise and just see how they do. The whole goal was to protect the revenue side. So I'd end by saying there are things you can do. Danny knows, I know everybody who's been a commissioner knew, and try to make improvements. And you could make the place run better and you could make the taxpayer experience better. But you're not going to be able to do it by just sort of bombing the organization.
There's a lot to unpack there. You talked a lot about the size of the workforce and some of the separations, whether voluntary or involuntary. John, let me dig in a little more on that. As I heard a lot about the news about people being separated from the IRS, it was coming at a time when it was right around the filing season. And I thought to myself, probably not the smartest time to reduce your staff. But astonishingly, when I filed my taxes, they were received by the government, processed, and completed in record time. I had never had it happen faster. But you're very concerned about the size of the workforce. Can you talk about what do you think the optimal size is, or what would be the things you would advise right now?
Well, first of all, it's a great credit to the agency and the employees who are wonderful and committed to the mission that the filing season ran very smoothly. It was all structured and set up with the resources they had and the great work that Danny and his team had done. So it did not surprise me that we got through the filing season in good shape. The real question was, and I think people making decisions understood you couldn't dismiss all those people at one time. But I was very concerned when 7,000 probationary employees were let go. A lot of those probationary employees had 10 or 15, 20 years of experience in IT or technology or other issues. So going forward, their goal always has been to become more efficient. My way of framing it was that the IRS, you ought to be able to deal with the IRS the way you deal with your financial institution. That is, you never really call people on the phone. You deal with it all online. You're able to see your account. You're able to see transactions. You're able to make inquiries. You're able to pay bills. Danny and the group made great progress by, in effect, allowing you to download documents rather than having to mail them in and then somebody opens them and they get routed to the right place. But those are changes that started. They were moving in the right direction. And I think my sense has always been that it's going to always take several thousand people on the phone answering people, because while 90% of people, give or take, will file online, there are always going to be 8 to 10% of the population, which is 15 million taxpayers, either uncomfortable or unable to deal with the process online. So they're always going to want to file on paper, and you're always going to have to deal with it. So you're always going to negotiate. The other issue with artificial intelligence is, in some ways, the IRS has always had artificial intelligence. Returns selected by an algorithm. People don't go through and individually select it. System, we have questions about these issues. And then somebody has to pick those up and decide, is this worth an audit? Should I call them up? Should I visit them? Should I send them a notice? And so the technology, if you say technology is going to do that, you're going to have a lot of notices going to people that shouldn't get them. So I think you can't get away from having an adequate number of people answering the phone, an adequate number of revenue agents and revenue officers. And whether that number is 60, 70, 80,000, 50,000 over the next 3 to 5 years depends on, as Dan says, your vision and what your the reality as you're making these adjustments. But right now, all I can tell you is I can guarantee you, if you lose 30 to 40,000 people in the next few months from that agency, it's not going to work and it's not going to be efficient.
I'm wondering if I could try out an analogy here. I love analogies, and I'm going to use this podcast to test one. So this point about the fact that the IRS had a good filing season and collections were robust. So why should we care about these cuts? Imagine there's a bad storm and your power goes out and you're worried about all the stuff in your fridge. So you're keeping the door closed. You open the fridge an hour later, things are still cold and still fresh. Doesn't mean that they're going to stay that way, right? If the power is cut and the power is cut indefinitely, eventually you're going to have a problem. So it's a mistake to evaluate the situation by opening that fridge up an hour after the power's gone off, or 2 hours, or maybe even 6 hours after the power's gone off. The reality is, without that power, things are not going to end in a good space, even though that milk might still be safe to drink for a few hours. So I am worried that not only are these steps going to undermine the important role the IRS plays in our tax system, but I'm also worried that if we evaluate it right now and assume everything is good because the milk is still fresh, then we're also making a mistake about the impacts of these cuts. John, what do you think of that analogy? Does it get a thumbs up?
I like that analogy. I think it's exactly right. It's what we've always been trying to say, is that it's a great credit to the system Danny set up and the people work, and the fact that the filing season went so smoothly was the kind of residual effect of having the right power, the right resources, permanent funding provided, allowing you to plan for 3 or 4 years in terms of IT improvements. All that's moving along well, and then you cut it all off. You suddenly take, as I say, not just a couple thousand people. At this point, you've already got 11,000 gone and 20,000 thinking about applying for the buyout. So you've just taken a lot of the muscle out of the system. You're crippling it, and you can't expect it if it's been running a 4-minute mile, and suddenly you say you're going to have to do it on 1 foot. You're not going to make it in 4 minutes. You're unlikely to make it at all.
Well, Danny, what do you have to do to keep that momentum going? We talk about people. There's obviously a technological aspect to it. There's probably a policy aspect to it. You did a lot of work to help modernize the agency. What has to happen now to keep a lot of that success and progress moving forward?
Well, I think you have to reestablish the importance of the IRS with a broader set of stakeholders, people on Capitol Hill, governors, others. I look, for example, at the debates going on right now about a new tax bill. If you are the Trump administration, I assume you want the tax bill to be implemented effectively. The last thing you want for a signature program is to have a healthcare.gov moment, right? You don't want to have a failure to launch and then you're cleaning up. I still think the Affordable Care Act suffers from that first impression of the website not working. As important and as many people believe as successful as the ACA has been, you still have like that immediate reaction of, oh yeah, that thing, the website didn't work, right? So you don't want that. And the tax bill that's being debated will require changes, forms changes, systems changes. You don't want a bunch of mistakes or to log on to do something under the new law and all you have is a frozen computer screen because the changes didn't take effect in a smart and strategic way. And so I think we just need to look for ways to reestablish across political fault lines that it's in everyone's interest for the IRS to function effectively. We need to reconsider an aggressive depletion of resources, zeroing out this budget line item, riffing this number of employees, not being thoughtful about the amount of institutional knowledge and leadership that's departing, because it's not going to benefit not just those that support the Democratic Party, those that support the Republican Party, all Americans. It's really not a political thing. Eventually, everybody needs the IRS to be effective. It might not be popular, but it is necessary. And so we got to get back to that type of conversation to make sure that we're holding people accountable in government and leadership positions to make sure that the tax system of this great nation is working effectively.
John, Danny just mentioned that tax administration should not be a political thing. Let's talk about a current issue, tax exemption. I just read a New York Post article about attempts to change Harvard's 501c3 status, which allows it to operate and accept donations tax-free. How are those decisions made? Is there some nonpartisan aspect of the IRS that has no political affiliation, or is that done from some office in the White House?
When the IRS was restructured by Congress in 1998, they had the commissioner for the first time have a 5-year term. And that was for two reasons. One is to encourage commissioners to stay longer than the usual year and a half or two that political appointees stay. But equally important, more important probably, was to send a signal that it's a non-political position, that the term would be separate from the presidential term, except every 20 years when the 5 years would equal out. And it was meant to send a signal that this agency affects everybody. I was unsuccessful in my tenure trying to get the Congress, as they were cutting the budget, to understand taxpayers aren't just Democrats or Republicans or independents, they're everybody. When the system doesn't work, it affects everybody. It should be a concern, I would think, of every congressman that they don't want their constituents all calling them saying, hey, what's wrong? How come the IRS doesn't function well? It does seem to me that Dennis rightly somehow got people to understand that this is not a political agency. After the famous Nixon's enemies list, where Nixon tried to, in fact, identify people's enemies or people that he was mad at that could be audited, the Congress passed specific legislation. And it doesn't say just generally outsiders aren't supposed to tell the IRS what to do. It specifically says the president, people in the White House, cannot suggest or order an audit generally, and certainly suggesting that Harvard or any university or any nonprofit lose its tax-exempt status is a violation of that statute. So that seems to be being ignored as people are talking about ending Harvard's tax-exempt status. They're talking about other organizations. And as a result, every nonprofit is concerned that the president or somebody in the White House will decide they don't like what you're doing, and therefore they'll tell the IRS to actually avoid the tax exemption. I mean, it's not as if even it's a violation of the statute to suggest the IRS take a look at it. It's an even greater violation to say the IRS should rescind the tax exempt status of any organization. So it's troubling because it goes against the grain of the IRS being non-political and looking at things on the merits and on the facts. And if taxpayers start to think that every audit's questionable, am I being audited as a question being raised because of something in my return? Or is it being raised because something I said, or some organization I belong to, or some organization I support? It seems to me that's going to undermine confidence in the IRS and the tax system. It's going to undermine confidence in the government if people think the president can go after you in a lot of different ways, including having you audited.
That's certainly an issue that's garnered a lot of attention. Danny, let's talk about another issue that's getting quite a bit of attention. I'd imagine the broader goal of the current administration is to gather data and use it to improve either transparency, effectiveness, or efficiency. There's a lot of information out there. There's news reporting saying that the Department of Government Efficiency wanted access to IRS data. There are other reports saying that immigration enforcement offices and agencies wanted access to this data. Both have caused a lot of alarm. But isn't this government just sharing data with government, or is it something else? Can you give us some background and help us understand what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, there are legal requirements that the IRS has for maintaining taxpayer data only inside the IRS. They're not allowed to share that data, your sensitive taxpayer information, outside the IRS unless the statute and Congress specifically authorizes that sharing. There are a variety of reasons why the IRS isn't allowed to share your information. People who are submitting their sensitive information have expressed through public comment, through hearings, through town hall meetings, et cetera, and through other intermediaries. It worries me if my taxpayer information is used beyond just for the purposes of filing my taxes. I want there to be firewalls. So that has been an express desire of the public, and therefore the statutes that are written are set up to strictly prohibit the IRS from sharing information. One of the reasons is because IRS employees are trained to protect that information. They don't always succeed. There are sometimes data breaches, but a lot of investment goes into making sure that we understand what to do and what not to do. So, for example, James, imagine you have 5 IRS employees today that have been very effectively trained. Suddenly you share taxpayer information with a federal employee from a completely different agency that might not have the same training. An employee doesn't realize that they shouldn't have taxpayer information on their laptop, that they shouldn't bring that laptop on the metro. What if they leave that laptop accidentally on the metro? We lose control over all the training and protocols if we just start sharing that information. So it's a combination of expectation of privacy and the reality that anyone who is an expert in data security knows that you need to run a very tight ship. So if you're going to expand the number of people or the number of systems that maintain sensitive information, you have to have a corresponding set of controls, disciplines, and investments to make sure that these new systems and these new people are not going to create new risks of broader unauthorized access, whether it's international cyber threats, insider threats, or domestic hackers. So there's a security issue. With respect to DHS, there's a very specific policy issue, which is, and look, I'm not debating the pros and cons of this policy, but a decision was made years ago that undocumented individuals would be given a safe harbor to file their taxes on the agreement that information would not be shared with immigration officials. The idea would be on net, we will benefit because we will get billions in revenue. These people will not stay in the shadows with respect to paying their taxes. They will pay into Social Security without getting Social Security. It was a decision that was made to be a trade-off. And now we, by sharing the information, have eliminated that safe harbor by sharing it with DHS. There's a cost to that. And again, I'm not an expert on the policy tensions here, but the fact is that before you do something like this, my preference would be to have a public vetting of it, whether it's through Congress, through an act of Congress. And right now, there is nothing in the IRS code that specifically authorizes the IRS to share data with the Department of Homeland Security for the purposes of immigration enforcement. There are other provisions which you could potentially maybe read and imply there's an authority there. I would prefer the authority to be very specific so Congress could hold hearings and have public debate around these issues, whether it's a privacy issue or a loss of revenue issue. If that's not happening and we're just running to share the information, then you got the data security issues. How safe are the new systems that the information will be in, and are the people trained? And you have the policy issues. without saying this was a good idea or a bad idea, I just think there's more work to be done before the idea was effected.
John, let's stay on the topic of big ideas and policy. My final question to you, we're hearing a lot about tax reform proposals, the no tax on tips or Social Security or overtime, and then a really bold one here, even no federal income tax at all. Apparently, changes in tariffs and tariff policy could make that a possibility. It seems as though bold reform, radical change, that's how the current administration is thinking about government policy and operations. But what would all of this mean for the IRS and revenue collection for our country more broadly?
There is some talk in this administration that we could get rid of the IRS and just fund the government on revenues from tariffs. And it's true in the 19th century, before the IRS was established, the government did fund itself with tariffs and excise taxes. And then people decided that was kind of regressive. An income tax spread over income groups would be better as you go forward. Now, the idea that you could get rid of the IRS totally and fund the government with tariffs is illusory. IRS collects over $5 trillion in revenues, collects, depending on who you ask, 96, 98% of government revenues. There's no chance. The highest estimate I've seen is tariffs might yield $1 trillion or maybe $1.5 trillion, which is a lot of money, but it's not enough to fund the entire government. The irony is the stated purpose of the tariffs is to support domestic industries and keep products out of the United States. The tariffs would be so high, it would be very expensive. So the more successful you are on that grounds, the less revenues you're going to collect. And the ultimate problem is even if you could do it with tariffs and collect that money actually, the increased cost goes through to increase cost of the taxpayer. And in effect, it's a regressive tax system. It's a sales tax. And so very wealthy billionaires will pay, in effect, more or less the same rate as working poor people and middle class people. So the idea that we're going to somehow fund the whole place with tariffs makes no sense at all. And so I used to send a letter in October, Senate Finance and Ways and Means Committee chairman saying there are so-called extenders where you have tax positions that are going to run out at the end of the fiscal year and they either get extended or cut off. Usually they're extended. There's a whole set of them. And my position to him was you can extend them, you can end them. What you can't do is change them. Because the minute you change the operation of any one of those specific provisions, you've got a lot of work you've got to do. And that's just for a handful of provisions. When you talk about significant tax changes, and discussions on the Hill now are significant, it takes a long time with a lot of people to make sure that the system functions, that you don't start sending out the wrong notices or shutting the system down in a way that it doesn't function. So it's a good question because on top of all the concerns we have about how the IRS is going to function normally with all the pressure and the loss of people, to add on top of it, let's change significant parts of the tax code at the same time to see how it goes. And then in Danny's analogy, not only are you cutting off the power, but you actually are sending a tornado through, and we're going to see if the refrigerator actually is left standing when you get done with it all.
So it sounds like we need tax collection to support federal revenue. We need an IRS. Danny, if that's the case, how do we make it the best IRS possible? The IRS hasn't always enjoyed the most favorable reputation. I know a lot of progress was made when you were there as commissioner, but it does touch every or nearly every person in our country. Give your successor some advice. What's needed to make sure the interactions with the IRS are the best possible experiences for people? And what's needed to make sure that the IRS can meet its mission now and going into the future?
Well, I think it's really important to build trust. One really critical example that I found is in the area of tax scams and schemes. The reality is that there are a lot of bad actors out there. The information age has brought with it a whole new set of scams and schemes, fake emails, fake texts, social media, reels that promise benefits in the tax system that are really just ways in which of getting yourself into trouble, links that you shouldn't click on that you'll end up with big headaches. And all of these are using the complexity of our tax system, the stress that people feel over the IRS as the mechanism for them to get exploited. whether it is an elderly person, a veteran. It's usually vulnerable populations that are the most subject to these scams, people who can't afford an accountant because, people get a call from the IRS. It's not really the IRS saying you owe a $4,000 tax debt. And if you don't pay it by midnight tonight with your credit card, then you are going to have your car repossessed or your house repossessed. All of that is fake. People who can afford an accountant call their accountant and their accountant deals with it. It's typically the vulnerable populations that are affected. The IRS needs to step in and be front and center in doing the consumer alerts and being part of the solutions that help take down these tax scams. There are these different avenues by which the IRS can present itself as the solution to help people, and that's one ingredient for how you build trust. I think you also have to go up to Capitol Hill and convince those that would promote the destruction of the IRS, the elimination of the IRS, the demonization of the IRS, and try to convince them not to do that, even though it might get them more clicks or more political donations, that there may be other ways to do it without damaging our voluntary compliant tax system. I don't know if that will be effective, but maybe. And that would be something I would really encourage the new commissioner to do. I mean, he's a former member of Congress. Maybe he will have some sway with convincing those members of Congress that typically denounce the IRS not to under his leadership.
A lot of concern, but a lot of good insight about what to do about it. Former IRS Commissioners John Koskinen and Danny Werfel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.